Well, the synopsis of the movie, Your Name Must Be Love, the story begins in which is Baghdad today, and a strange phenomena moves across the heavens the day that Abraham is born, and everybody is just amazed. His father is a high priest for the ziggurat. And then we see Abraham as a youth, and he's a seeker, and he looks at the moon and he thinks, well, maybe that's God. And then he sees it set, and then he eventually ends up saying he's going to follow the one who created heaven and earth. The next we see him as a young man, and he enters his father's idol shop with fierce determination. He tries to convince the people not to believe in these idols. What can they do for them? They can't do anything for you. And his father won't listen to him. He's very frustrated. They've had this conversation. It's not a new discussion. And when he's alone in the shop, he takes his right hand and he knocks every idol down except one. And the people come running and he tells them, he points to the big idol and he says, ask it to help you. And then he has to flee for his life with his beloved wife Sarah and his father. He goes to Haran. His dad dies there, and Abraham grieves. God tells Abraham's sitting outside looking at the sky, and God starts to speak to him and tells him that he's going to be a blessing to all peoples of the world, and that he's going to have a child. And he goes home to Sarah, and he's trembling, and he tells Sarah they have to go to a new land, to Canaan, where God had told him to go. And Sarah is upset and distressed, as she was when they left before. Then they go to to Canaan, and they live there for some years, and they prosper. But she's still not having a child, and she's getting very upset. She and then a famine occurs, and a traveler comes through from Egypt, and he has food. So Sarah tells Abraham that they have to go to Egypt. And Sarah is very, very beautiful. When they get to Egypt, they make a plan where she will pretend she's Abraham's sister, because Abraham says that Pharaoh will have him killed. And they meet Pharaoh, and Pharaoh falls in love with Sarah, and it gets to the point where Abraham has to tell him that Sarah is his wife, and the Pharaoh is furious and expels them. But as they're leaving, the slave Hagar, who we already know is the daughter of a king and descended from a great Arab prophet, Pharaoh gives Hagar to Sarah as her personal servant, slave. So they go back home, and then eventually Sarah gets so desperate that she tells Abraham to sleep with Hagar to father an heir for them. Hagar does, and there's great joy, and the joy persists for about 7 years. And they're all delighted, Hagar, Sarah, and Abraham, about their son. And then angels come to Abraham and tell him that Sarah is going to have a child. Now, Sarah is listening behind the tent flap, and she laughs, and she says, at my age, to lie down with my husband and have a child? And the angel kind of calls her out and says, Sarah, you're laughing. And Sarah says, no, I'm not. Anyway, so then Sarah has a child, and Isaac, and she no longer wants to share the inheritance with Ishmael. So she asks Abraham to expel Hagar and Ishmael into the desert. Ishmael almost dies of thirst, and Hagar calls God out and says, you are not going to make me watch my child die. And then a spring of water bursts forth right from there. And although I don't mention it in the movie, that spot does become the Kaaba. at Mecca. And meanwhile, Abraham, is distraught about the loss of his son, and he gets so crazed that he thinks that God wants him to kill his son. Sarah is pulling on his arm, begging, screaming for him not to kill their son. And Abraham just tears out of the room. He brings Isaac with him, and then he goes to Hagar's house, and he gets Ishmael. It's night. Now, when they get to Mount Moriah, we, the audience, do not see which boy goes up on that hill. And Abraham brings him up, and the boy is has a beautiful spirit, as becomes clear by, some things he says. And then Abraham raises his knife, and when he does, God calls out, booms, his voice thunders, yelling at him to stop, and meanwhile an angel is grabbing his arm. And then God rewards Abraham because he did not kill the boy. And when he goes back home, Sarah has died. And his steward, who is also a great character in the story, Eliezer, he meets him and he tells him. And then the next scene, well, that's a whole great scene, but I'm not going to go into all the details. They're all great stories. And eventually, Abraham is very old. He goes to visit Ishmael at Mecca, and Keturah is there, whom many believe to be Hagar. He has had 6 more children with her, 6 more sons. Isaac is there too, and Abraham tells him that he wants to build an altar at Mecca, at the place where the spring saved Hagar and Ishmael. And they go there, the whole family goes there, and the household and everybody, and they start digging there for the altar, and they find the altar that Adam and Eve built there, and that's a whole nother wonderful story, an Arab story that is so poetic and beautiful, and Keturah tells the story. And then they go ahead and they build the altar, and an angel appears, and he has a stone. He gives them a white oblong stone to be the finishing stone on the final corner. And they set it up so Abraham can climb up there and set that final stone in there. And when he steps on the stone, his sandal burns an imprint onto the stone. And then they put that stone up in the corner. And then God talks to Abraham again, and he asks him to go to every corner of the altar, to every direction, the 4 directions, and call all people of the world there. And they have a wonderful conversation. Abraham is like, how can I call all the people of the world here, Lord? They're not going to hear me, kind of thing. And then coming to the end of the film, there's a festival of the first fruits, and Abraham's children and grandchildren, Isaac and Ishmael and so on, they come and present him with the first gifts of the harvest, and they're having a celebration. It's really, really nice. And then the scene is where Abraham is being buried. And the very last scene is animation or special effects, but the idea is that a tree of life comes out from the earth and is growing into the stars, and out of that come, billions of descendants. There's Abraham, and then there's Hagar, and out of them come all the Arab descendants, and Abraham and Sarah, and out of them come all the Jewish descendants. It eventually shows Jesus and Muhammad, although it does not show Muhammad's face, and it goes into the stars, and that's the end of the story. something